Hello, and welcome to Design Systems Community Chapter Toronto, meetup number 8. Let us begin. Today's meetup is Laying Foundations for Quality, and the date is September 16, 2020. Welcome to this remote meetup to all of our attendees worldwide. I can see some comments in various cities, and we'll talk more about cities in a moment. Because the first thing we do at every meetup is a land acknowledgement. The land I'm standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. The code of conduct has begun the moment you joined. Please respect each other and keep it legal, play nice, and uphold the conduct and our values. Also protect your privacy. There are links that conveniently located in the description below for Slido, for Q&A, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Finally, who am I? My name is Enrico Sacchetti. I'm a developer by trade and one of the co-organizers of DSCC Toronto.
Hi guys, my name is Lucy. I'm a designer at Shopify and also a co-organizer of the Toronto chapter.
Hey everyone, my name is Varun. I am a product manager and also a co-organizer for DSCC Toronto. All right, over the course of the meetup, we're going to be leveraging a tool called Slido. So if you can hop on to sli.do or even slido.com, both of them work, and enter the event code 68754. Over the course of the meetup, you can actually ask questions and upvote questions that other people have asked, and we will be leveraging the tool in the Q&A section for that. Next slide. Perfect. So while you're getting on slido.com, we want to know what city you're joining from. So enter your answer and we'll get to the word map right away.
That's right. So there's also, just a friendly reminder, a convenient link to Slido in the YouTube description below. So you can click that once and check it out. And I see some answers are filling in. Look at all these places.
All right.
Now, if only the words were proportional to the actual geographical size. That's not exactly the case here.
So given it's a Toronto meetup, we're seeing a bunch of folks from Toronto, but we got friends from San Francisco and Berlin.
Is that London, UK, or London, Ontario?
That's going to be a tough one to identify.
I see Kitchener, which is close to London.
Nice. Yeah, we just want you to get accustomed to the tool so it can be easy to leverage it in the Q&A section.
That's right. So just keep Slido open on your phones or browsers, and you'll be able to ask questions as our speakers present. And then the top voted questions, given our choice, will be asked to the speaker afterwards.
Awesome. I think we can keep the Slido on and move on to the next slide, please. Great. All right, so these are the design systems community values, 7 values that we compass in every meetup that we do, as well as every talk. If you're already part of a design system team, building a system, or planning to build one, you'll definitely see these 7 values play in. We at Design Systems Community also want to ensure that these 7 values are played as part of every meetup. In today's talk, both Ahmed and Kaelig will be covering parts of these. All right, we have an announcement. We just released our Design Systems Community resources on our website. So hop on to designsystems.community/resources. You can view all the past recordings, presentations, and more goodies coming up very soon. All our chapters based out of all the different cities will have all their resources in the Resource Center. And yes, become a design systems community chapter. Today, we have 5 chapters, one in Toronto, the one that's serving right now, one in Berlin, Dublin, Mexico City, and Czechia. If you and your city are interested to start a new design systems community chapter, hop onto our website and submit a request, and we'll be happy to connect with you. And a big thank you to our gold and silver sponsor, so Wrangle.io as our gold sponsor and Scotiabank as our silver sponsor. And also a big thank you to all our volunteers. I want to do a special shout out for Donna Vitan. She's been handling our social media and she's rocking up with a post. So big thank you to Donna.
Thank you, Varun. And now let's get to the agenda. We are the last thing in the way of fun and learning. Starting off, we'll have a talk by Ahmad Nassri, which is Modern Patterns in Modular Software Design. And then following up is Kaelig Deloumeau-Prigent with the evolution of Shopify's color system. We're looking forward to all that. Please ask lots of questions on Slido. And let us begin, starting with Ahmad Nassri. Ahmad is a software developer and advocate of all things open source, a startup advisor and mentor to entrepreneurs and developers. He founded Tech Masters, which is a developer community of over 10,000 members engaging in discussions on technology, careers, and learning. He's currently a fractional CTO supporting multiple startups, and prior to his current role, he was CTO of NPM, Chief Architect for TELUS Digital, and VP of Engineering at Kong. So please give a warm welcome to Ahmad.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. Just as we're getting our slides set up, I'm going to give everybody a chance to readjust. So yeah, I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about modern patterns and modular software design. But before we get into that, thank you, Enrico, for the great intro. Thank you, Varun and Lucy, for setting this up. It's a great community. I've been following it from far away and really excited to talk to the members of the community and share some of my lessons and advice over the years. So with that, let's get into the slides action. Enrico already kind of went over this. My name is Ahmad Nassri. I'm a fractional CTO. I do a lot of community work and have been in different roles in different companies, mostly working on development tooling and developer ecosystems. I get asked a lot about my logo, so I figured I'll do a quick intro about that. This is actually just my name. It's just the word Ahmed in Arabic. It's written in a special font called the Square Kufic script. It's actually way back from the 12th century, and an interesting tidbit about it: it was originally used to decorate walls and castles and historical kind of buildings. Now was considered kind of like an original pixel. So back in the day, you would have a pixel wording, and then you construct a whole mosaic of things with it. And the color is inspired by the coat of arms of the Nasser dynasty, which was in Granada and Spain. And I'm kind of like putting that as a future travel plans for me once the pandemic finishes, where we can go back and actually go visit the castle of Alhambra in Spain and see all these kind of historical monuments there. Anyways, hopefully that was interesting to some of you. Let's get into the tech. So today we're going to be talking about modern patterns and modern software design. And there's 3 things that I'd like to focus on: getting the what out of the way, just to align on the meaning of the modular software and what does that mean, getting into the context of why is it important, and then starting to share some of the advice and some of the patterns that I've been using and I've seen being successful in scaling modern work, modular software design and modern software development. Let's start with the what. What does it mean when I say modular? The word obviously has a lot of meanings, but the meaning I kind of tend to fall back towards is one that's really old, from 1978, way back in the day when software knowledge wasn't done online using blog posts and wikis and forums. It was actually through journals that were published over print and paper. back in the day, there was the Bell Systems Technical Journal, and a person by the name of Ken Thompson kind of put together what is now referenced as the Unix philosophy, which are the 4 points on how to build software in a way that is modular, in a way that is empathetic to fellow developers and fellow system designers. Basically, each of these points kind of boil down to, number one, make each program do one thing well. And if you need that program to do something else, maybe make another program. Essentially, the topic of programs back then, if you're familiar with the Unix systems, it's kind of CLI-driven applications that are responsible for data processing and sharing data between each other. But each application does its own thing, and it's focused on doing one functionality. Number two, expecting the output of each program to become the input to another. This is a fundamental piece of Linux and Unix in the sense that you can run an operation in one program and be able to seamlessly pass it to another and do a completely different type of an operation without having to write a translation layer between them. At the time, program development was still new, and the modern way of building software hasn't really surfaced yet. So these lessons were still in the infancy of software system design and development. So this concept of every program should be able to transfer input from one to another was new and interesting. Now we kind of take it for granted. Number three is design and build software that even operating systems tend to be retired over time, and maybe sometimes it takes a week, sometimes it takes a month, sometimes it takes years to retire an old system. But basically, you have to keep in mind when you're designing and building software to design it in a way that you can actually throw it away and rebuild them when you need to. And again, we're all familiar with that today, but it's interesting to see that coming from 1978 as a principle of building systems for the future, is that you can't think of your software or your application to be forever alive or forever green. You got to think about how you're always going to be building it to be replaceable or refactorable. And number four, use tools. The idea there is very simple. Don't try to take on the burden of building everything into your program. If there are tools or software that can assist you in doing the work, do that. And the key focus here, focusing on the sanity of the developer, because you shouldn't have to build everything from scratch yourself. You can actually leverage the work of others. And if that work helps you get where you need to go, then that's even better. This is all framed in the context of 1978. So what we're going to do next, we're going to try to take that and reframe it in the context of today and think about real life examples of why that's important and how would that work. So just to summarize, this is a 41-year-old kind of philosophy, but it's still relevant today because it emphasizes on building small, simple, and clear modular and extendable code that can be easily maintained, which is the key that we're looking for, and more importantly, repurposed by developers other than yourself. And I think this is the key point that I keep coming back to, is that when you're writing software, you should write it with, like we already said, it's being throwaway, it's being easy to use, it's being simple to maintain, because you're not going to be the person to write that forever and maintain it forever. So you should have a little bit of empathy for the person who's going to come after you and how they're going to be able to manage that and use the software. Let's talk about what is not modular. I don't know why my slides here are duplicated. Oh, there we go. So when I say modular, I don't mean packages necessarily. That's a topic that people always confuse when we talk about packages. Packaging is a mechanism of shipping software, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every module should be its own package. At the same time, when I say modular, I don't necessarily mean microservices. People always confuse that. Microservices is just a method in which you choose to deploy and manage your software systems or your design your organizations. It's not necessarily how you want to write your code. You can actually have a modular monolith. Modular architecture also doesn't mean modular software. Modularity in terms of software mechanisms, like for a good example, would be like Adobe applications. They're modular. There's an application for image editing. There's an application for SVG editing, and so on. Like, these are modular in a sense that they're separate purposes and separate programs, not necessarily that they're built in a modular architecture. It could be both, but it's not necessarily one excludes the other. And ultimately, you don't want to shift the burden of a single product in a modular sense to your end users. You want to have that invisible from your end users. And be modular like Unix. The reason I'm referencing the Unix example more for the historical like reference than legacy, rather than just do everything in the Unix way. I'm not expecting everybody to become a Unix guru. I am not. But the ideas that apply from those patterns are still applicable, and especially in the world that we live in today, where we have to worry about other people who want to maintain our code in the future, and potentially when you're building systems that are shared and used across the organization, it becomes even more important. So let's talk about why this is important. Why does this matter? Well, here's the secret about software development. It's about people. And as much as we'd all like to think that our systems and our platforms and our architecture are built in a way that is scalable for by itself, it's really about the people who use it and about the systems in which they rely on. And that's the problem, is when we talk about the relationship between the teams, the departments, the people who use the software, we kind of tend to default of thinking of dependencies. And then we get down the path of thinking of packages and systems to manage package systems and sharing code in that way. But it's not necessarily that. It's more about the human relationship and how that works through a process, and where does the architecture paradigms come in between that to help. And as we all know, no matter the org that you're in, no matter the company that you're part of, it's a mess. Humans are a mess by nature, and therefore companies and organizations that humans work within are also a mess. And usually they're a mess of dependencies across humans, and the designs of the organizational human communication patterns and work patterns and workflows between them tend to surface in software design, and really it shouldn't. Software systems should always survive the organizational change, because organizational change is inevitable. It always happens. There's actually a great quote unquote law for this. Is called Conway's law, which is organizations which design systems to be constrained to the way they communicate will inevitably have the software reflect the way the human communication patterns, as opposed to the way the software should be built. So just don't fall into that trap. If you want to solve software dependencies, well, guess what? There is already a pattern for that. There's software dependency management systems, and package management systems are designed to solve the software dependency management, but not the human management problems. So anyways, the summary in all of this comes back to we want to build software in a modular way that helps our fellow colleagues and coworkers and other users of our applications or code, but we don't want to design it in a way that reflects organizational systems and kind of become very dependent on people and title and roles. So how does this work in a modern setting? We're talking about theoretical stuff. Ultimately, again, we're talking about long-term sustainability here. And actually, this was a very interesting tweet that I saw yesterday from Leah Baru. Hope I'm pronouncing her name properly. But initially, in your early career as a software developer, you start thinking of, how do we make things fast and hacky and interesting, and let's build the more complicated things and use the most recent technology and more cutting edge systems. But over time, we realize, again, because we're looking at the future maintainers, we're looking at knowledge transfer, we're looking at how do you maintain it and update a system over time, or modules within the system. You start paying it more attention to things like code readability over repeatability. You start paying more attention to maintainability over functionality, because ultimately your task as a software engineer over time shifts from writing the code and making it work to maintaining the code and sharing it with others. So let's go back to those Unix philosophy principles and see how we can rephrase them in a little bit of rewording that matches today's terminology, and probably should say 2020 on that slide, not 2019. I've given it a stock in 2019. I should probably update that. So number one, each module should do one thing well. Back in the 1974, they were talking about each program should do everything well. In today's world, we're going even smaller in units. So we're talking about each module of software application should do one thing very well. Each output of every module should become the input to another. And again, if you're in a design system world, that kind of makes a lot of sense when you're thinking of front-end code. You might a front-end component might output a list of data, and then each of those list of data entries or items represent another module being able to use that and render them. It's a little bit more complicated on backend systems and kind of infrastructure systems, but the principle still stands. being able to throw away the clumsy part and rebuild them. I mean, that just carries over as is. Refactoring is a part of nature, especially if you're going to be refactoring your code to keep up with security updates, with dependency changes, with different practices and patterns that you're going to apply into your software design. So building things for future refactoring is actually important. And then using tools to lighten your programming task. Again, in today's world, you can't really build any modern web development app project without relying on a whole plethora of tools. So keeping that in mind, it's better to adopt and choose the right tools than it is to kind of build your own, customize your own workflows. And last and most importantly, the summary of all of this really comes down to modules should be easily maintained and repurposed by developers other than its creators. I never plan in any of my work or roles to always be there forever, and neither should you. Your interests might change, your job function might change, your company might change, your org might change. You should always pay empathy to the person who's coming after you and how they're going to be able to maintain and work on the code that you've created today. So let's dive even deeper. What would be a good example of that? I kind of put together this very simplistic, not real, typical app example. In your typical application, you have a bunch of what I would otherwise label as modules or components. We've kind of done a very good job in thinking of modularizing front-end components because visually that's easier for us to kind of theorize about and separate visually, but it really applies to a lot more things than just the front-end components. And the first principle that I'm going to start sharing and the first practice that I'm going to start sharing with you is gotta start thinking of your apps as packages. Going back to the principle of each module can do one thing really well, and to also satisfy the principle of throw away the clumsy parts and rebuild them, if your application is split into independent pieces, you can satisfy these rules, right? These principles. There's no better representation of, each module should do one thing well than a self-encapsulated software package. It has its own testing, it has its own functionality, it has its own README. It's very well described. And then at the same time, looking at throwaway parts, because of software package dependency management systems, versioning and replacing of a package is a known pattern that we can rely on. So therefore, throwing away a clumsy part, you can throw away a whole module altogether and not feel the pressure of rebuilding your entire software application. A good kind of example of this, of how you can think of that, you no longer have one app project where you have a top-level application directory or a source directory, however you name it. Use the software package dependency management systems, whether it's NPM, PHP, Ruby, or Python, or otherwise. You can even componentize or modularize your application deployment itself with things like Docker and Docker Compose, and using the patterns that we're all familiar with, like READMEs and GitHub repos. Otherwise, you can describe the behavior of how should it be deployed and run and organized. And maybe you can have one index file or maybe more than one entry point. But regardless, you can start splitting out your code base. And ultimately, your actual end application becomes just a bunch of dependencies that you're declaring in your package.json. And your index.js file is just an entry point for that application. A couple of examples, things you can actually package. UI components, we're familiar with that. This is the design system community. You know exactly what I'm talking about here. But you can do the same thing for backend API routes. You can do the same thing for data modules and associated mocking tests for them. You can keep all of them in the same monorepo if you wish, or you can separate them into separate repositories. You can publish them as individual packages. You can keep them as in the same repo. It doesn't matter the end deployment path for the individual packaging, but the modularization of the code means that it's self-contained in a way, which means you have more control, granular control over it. So looking back at that example of, again, a very simplistic app example, by highlighting the areas that are common or shared, you can see how you can group things in a logical way. So you can have a module that represents the users, let's say, and within that module, all the front-end components are there, and also all the tests for them are, but also all the database models, maybe even all the pages that the users would look at as part of their user profile. You can group that stuff together. Similarly, in a concept example of like a billing, we already do things like billing components for front-end UI elements, but why wouldn't you also have the database modules grouped together as maybe their own component or part of a top-level component like a global billing component. Your API routes can live in there, your page views can live in there, and so on, so on, so on. Again, this is not a copy-paste pattern for you to apply, but I'm just using this for illustration purposes. Think of what are the higher order entries that you can group together, and think of a global module for your application stack. And some might actually point out and say, well, isn't this domain-driven design? Kind of. Domain-driven design is talking about the way the application architecture should be designed, but it doesn't really go as far as like how do you take it and deploy it? How do you group it together, right? And also doesn't touch on interdependencies between departments and teams and people. So like by packaging a billing component together or a billing module together, you can actually feel confident in anybody coming in and touching and working on it, regardless of what team they're on, because A, it's versioned, B, it contains all its testing and all its relevant changes for database and front-end elements. So if a change happens on it, inevitably the tests will have to cover everything from front-end to back-end to database to modules and APIs and everything in between. And because it's versioned, it's going to version as a new version. That doesn't mean that it will immediately be pushed to production and it will break everything. It means there's an adoption story that follows that, which means every application that uses it has to go update it. Its own tests will have to be applied, and so on and so forth. So the patterns that we already know from a package management perspective can be applied to building a better modular software systems. Number 2, documentation. It's all of that, everything I just mentioned will be ineffective if you don't have a good investment in documentation and therefore knowledge sharing. Again, going back to the principles, modules should be easily maintained and repurposed by developers other than its creators. How do you do that? You might leave the company or change teams or be put into a different project. You don't even know who the person after you is going to be and what they're going to be tasked to do with the software piece or the module that you've been creating for this whole time. So creating enough documentation, not just about how to run the code, but why was it created in the first place? What purpose does it serve? How is it being used? And potentially any differences or any materials or people that the future person can actually go and talk to or read up about. Put in a contribution guide if in case you're working in an open collaborative environment where everybody can contribute to all the modules. Help them help you by maintaining this package or this module in an effective way. Again, I can go on and on about software documentation because it's a topic that's sore for me and for a lot of developers. It's hard to write documentation, but think about the reality of software and how it works. Soon after you write the software, sometimes even before you finish writing it, you lose track of what you're actually doing or what the original problem you're solving. So you're helping yourself by documenting, not just the future person. And documentation doesn't just have to be written technical wording. Documentation can surface in a lot of different ways. It could be meeting minutes, it could be bug reports, it could be user stories, pull request comments even. The versions themselves and the fact that a change happened is a form of documentation. That all gives contextual information to the person after you to come and help you. And another thing to note, things that are not documentation, which I see a lot of teams doing, Slack chats, that's not documentation. That's not a way to transfer knowledge. You can't point a person to a Slack chat history and say, oh, this is where we discussed something. It's not effective. Code itself is not documentation. It's not a good way to, again, cover the why and the what. Code might actually help you understand the how the thing works, but only within the confines of that code itself, not any external system that it might touch. So you can't rely on code as documentation, as well as discussions or video calls or other things. It's hard to actually send a person, here, just watch this webinar or watch this kind of meeting that we recorded as a form of documentation is not as effective as a purpose-built or a purpose-written or even recorded form of knowledge sharing. Number 3, test coverage. You can write the best amount of documentation that you want, but if you don't give tools for the future maintainer to also understand the inputs and the outputs and the change that might happen or the breakage that might happen if they change something, again, it satisfies the same principle, which is being easily maintained and repurposed by people other than the original creator. Even if you want to talk about other principles, if you want to talk about each module should be able to do one thing well, prove it. Prove it with the tests, right? Like that's your acceptance criteria typically for shipping software. Why wouldn't it be for the future maintainer of your software? even being able to throw away clumsy parts and rebuild them, that's where tests help you. You can't achieve throwing away and refactoring if you don't have a solid testing strategy. And it really forces you on building a better experience for the next person, like we said. Testable code doesn't necessarily mean like anybody can come in and take over and get the full context, but it helps them at least maintain what they've been handed over. And full coverage isn't really about writing code. It's a topic that a lot of people debate whether you should have full for test coverage or not. But really, it's more about writing more code or more tests. It's more about writing code that is more testable. So if you're finding it harder and challenging to make a full coverage of your code bases or your current modules, perhaps you should revisit the way those modules are built, because it should not be uphill effort to write full code coverage just for the purpose of getting that 100% test coverage. Perhaps you got to re-architect what you got or refactor what you got so it's more testable. And if you could think about it in a different lens, code that doesn't have coverage on it basically means there are modules that are not being tested. And that's a signal for the future maintainer or an adopter of your product or application that this is not good quality. So how would I trust that your code is of certain quality if you haven't even bothered written the coverage code for it and the full test coverage for it? And if that's not enough motivation, always think of your code as write your code as the guy who's going to come after you is going to be a violent psychopath who knows where you live. That's the motivation I have. I don't want to be getting a knock on my door and a future maintainer of something I built kind of shouting at me for writing something that's psychotic. So I assume everybody's going to come after me is going to be a violent psychopath, and I just don't want to deal with that. All right, number 4. Again, these are a lot of effort and time spent in writing code, writing modular code, writing unit tests for it, making 100% test coverage, writing documentation, describing the changes. But the good news is there's automation for all of that. So use automation where you can. This is an example of a tweet that actually happened with somebody, and I'm actually doing similar things today in my code stack. Gabriel, as in the tweet, as indicated, he's using a bot. A bot found a vulnerability in the dependency they're using. The bot sent a pull request to fix the dependency. The CI system verified the pull request because it ran a full unit coverage test. Another bot merged it, and then another bot came in and celebrated the merge with a GIF. No humans were harmed in the process, nor humans were involved in the process. And at some point, I assume there was another bot that came in and deployed the code. So this is all great and well for actually taking on all this additional effort that I'm describing in my recommendations, but not actually having to spend a lot of energy and time doing it. And bots are here to make your job easier, not take it away. In case you're worried about bots taking your job away, they can check for bugs, open pull requests, update dependencies, refactor your code, even merge pull requests. And then at the end, they'll just high-five each other and you can just watch it and have fun. Ultimately, use the tools, like we said before, and some of these Unix principles. There are a lot of tools that help you, and the whole point of this whole conversation is you might want to take a little bit of additional effort in consideration of the people who are going to come after you and be empathetic to them and how they're going to maintain your code or even just adopt your software if that's the case. And doing things in a modular sense does introduce a lot of complexity for managing your code and managing all the different modules you're going to create. But the good news is there's a lot of tools, whether they're bots or automations or software systems. There's a lot of tools that can help you do that. This is but a snapshot of them, the ones I'm familiar with or I've seen before. There's plenty of tools. Can't even count them in your mind of how many tools there are to help you manage modular systems and modular software. And yeah, ultimately, the last point I'll say is just think of the developer who's going to come after you, whether it's a year from now, a month from now, or 5 years from now, and how they're going to maintain and manage your systems. Modular software hopefully makes it a bit easier for you and them to get a full context of what's happening. And that's all I had to say. The one thing I would say is I'm posting a blog post today. If you're interested, go to my blog and check it out. I will be posting it right after this talk. I'm going to be talking about the challenges of scaling a modern practice for CTOs and technical leaders. You might be interested in that. You might want to share it with some of your leaders. I talk a lot about the complexity that comes with modular software design and modular cloud-based systems, and how modern challenges that can be alleviated at a leadership level, different than what we're talking about here today with software development and coding levels. And that is it.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. And now we're going to get started with questions and answers. Varun is going to lead us off into Q&A mode directly to you.
All right, love to see you. Let's kick it off with the first question. Well, first of all, Ahmed, thank you very much for the talk. I did learn a lot. I've learned a lot from you when we worked together too. But let's kick it off. The first question is, you mentioned developing with empathy, making code readable and maintainable. Can you provide some recommendations for developers to achieve this in their jobs?
Well, I think I just went through all of that. I think there's the technical way of being empathetic, which is the 5 recommendations that I'm talking about. Writing things in a more modular way, break your apps down into packages, focus on documentation, and use tools where you can, because you take away any sort of custom workflows and pipelines that you will have to build. Tools by themselves, by nature, if you're using a SaaS product or a tool, there are documentation and manuals and things that the future developer can read. And there's test coverage that you can introduce the context of the change for the future developer. That's all technical ways of being empathetic to the future developer. I think there's definitely more outside of that scope when it comes to human interaction and human communication. The challenge that I would keep in mind is there's a lot of easy answers you can think about of being empathetic when you're working on the same team, at the same time, in the same place. But as you probably have seen now, the whole world is working remotely. And distance of physical communication is a challenge. You have people who work, and I've been in situations where you have people who work across the same company, but across different countries and cities and regions. They speak different languages. They have different cultures. They have different understanding and expectations, different time zones. So there's a lot of human element of communication and empathy that you have to take into consideration, whether you're in a physical office working together, or you're working remotely across languages and cultures and physical space. And then the more important one, or more complex one, I would say, is across different times. Because if I'm here today and the code that I write today might be maintained by somebody else completely 2 or 3 years down the line, I don't have a time travel machine. I can't just go in and talk to that person or get on a Zoom hangout with them. I have to communicate across time and space in a way that makes their life easier. And I think that's a harder problem to solve. But I think a lot of the patterns that you think about should start from a technical perspective, at least from, if you're going to make things easier for yourself in the future, you can start by making them easier for another future person. So I can only comment on the technical aspects of how that can be effective, because I think it's the inception and starting point. Beyond that, there's a lot of human, empathetic, and communication kind of approaches that one can actually follow and look on. But I think that's outside the scope of the technical, and I think we can spend a whole meetup just talking about that.
Thanks for that. We have another question from the audience. You mentioned that meetings and calls are not considered documentation, and yet many decisions are made during those meetings. What is a team supposed to do during those circumstances?
Easy. If that decision is not written down and shared afterward, it is not real. I would assume, personally, if I am invited to a meeting and there's no agenda to that meeting, then I'm just going to assume it's a beers night or a hangout, right? Like, it's not a serious meeting. And therefore, also the outcome of that meeting, if it's not codified and written down in any certain format that your team is normalized, then how are you expected to action that? Think of your product backlogs and kind of sprint planning, or any sort of quote unquote codified task management workflow that you use, regardless if it's waterfall, agile, Kanban, whatever. Somebody actually takes the effort of writing down the story. As a user, I want to do X, or here's the functionality, here's the bug, here's the expected outcome, here's the fix. Meetings should have the same mechanism. If you don't codify the outcome of the meeting into something tangible and measurable, then you can't really rely on the success of the outcome. Because even if you and I attended a meeting, we discussed something, and then we went away, maybe I'm leaving the job tomorrow, so good luck getting that job done. Maybe I got the we don't like to use the bus factor anymore. Let's call it the lottery factor, right? Maybe I win the lottery tomorrow. Okay, what happens to that meeting then? Who's gonna do the thing that we verbally discussed that nobody else knows about? Codifying that carries over the sense of the documentation that we talked about, because then anybody can do it. And by virtue of writing it down, you're not just writing down the desired outcome. You have to write down the input that leads to that desired outcome, meaning that you have to share enough of the context so that anybody can come in and do that work, assuming that they have the same level of access and context setting that you set for them. Which also means at some point you can maybe get rid of meetings altogether, because meetings are pointless. Assuming you invest enough in context setting and writing and codifying inputs and outputs.
Totally. I mean, being a product manager, I do get involved myself in a lot of meetings, I've noticed. But yeah, having like a decision log or somewhere to putting all the answers and sort of the decision that popped up and then sharing that with the community is definitely important. All right. Next question. How do you get the organization to encourage or put priority into documentation and testing when they're actually focused on delivery?
Yes, that's the age-old question. Well, I'm going to do a bit of a self-serving answer here. It's like, well, if you want help in that, I'm doing fractional CTO consulting. So if you're interested, make an introduction. I'll come and help you set the tone for that. But at the same time, like more practical examples, this is not easy, and nobody has a clear answer on it, and definitely will be contextual per organization or team. But historical evidence is typically a good starting point, right? Everybody has bugs. There's no perfect system. But if you look into the history of how the bugs came to be, 99% of the time, it's because there was not enough time invested in testing. Almost all bugs are preventable had the team spent enough time or invested more time in discovery and testing and quality assurances, whatever the process may be, manual or otherwise. I don't like manual, but this doesn't matter. The point is, and I know this for a lot of companies, it's just all about ship, get it out, feature delivery, look at our velocity. Hey, we're happy. And then things break and then they blame the developer. If you have enough of a historical evidence, or at least references to prior examples in the past, you can use that as evidence-based, because data-driven decisions are ultimately the ones that will change people's minds, as opposed to empathy-based or feeling-based kind of gut checks. We all know what it means to not invest enough in testing and quality assurances, but unless you can communicate that in a tangible way to a stakeholder, it's hard to kind of convince them of otherwise. So typically the first thing I would do is look at historical evidence, and then again measure the data of that and the impact. How did the story start? How much time did we discuss it? How much time did we invest in building it? And what were the motivating factors or the outside influences that kind of push that story forward, or delivery of that project forward, without investing enough time in testing or quality assurance?
Thanks for the detailed answer. And I think we're on to our last question for now. It is, how much care for the customer experience would you expect from a developer working either in the front end or back end? And this is like working with designers and also ensuring that the thing you're building is good for the customer.
Well, going back to the empathy piece, you can be completely selfish, and I can care less about the customer and the end user. And I want to be selfish for myself and selfish for the time I spend on things. So, that if there's not paid enough attention to, let's say, things like accessibility concerns, to responsive design concerns, to different functional behaviors that a user might expect, or making the user experience more complicated or more arduous, who's it going to come back to? It's going to go through product feedback, customer support feedback, all that kind of stuff, maybe angry customers. Sure, but ultimately, who's going to end up doing all the work? the developer will. So maybe it's in your best interest, and selfishly speaking, invest a little bit extra time in advocating for the user, because you want to be lazy and don't want to do extra work later on, depending on your perspective. But ultimately, I see this as a cost optimization. If you look at it as economics based, you're investing upfront in having a conversation about user experience, making sure that you're reflective of that in the amount of investment and estimation and how much writing of code you're doing. Because the product owner might tell you, we don't care, let's just build it for desktop for now, we'll do the mobile later. Or they might say, we don't care if it's too complicated for the user, or there's additional steps for the user, we'll come back and revisit this later. But from a coding practice perspective, that revisiting something later might actually mean refactoring the whole thing or rebuilding the whole thing. So the delta of effort involved in doing the planning upfront and just building systems that are scalable, that are dynamic, that are more flexible, is actually smaller than revisiting something later and trying to do it later. Because revisiting it later, even assuming you're the same person who's doing the work, you still have to remind yourself of what was this thing and how did we build it, how the code was written, what is this unit test doing. There's a lot of knowledge rebuilding that you have to do for yourself to self-maintain the code that you wrote from 6 months ago. And then when it comes to functional changes from a user experience perspective, you might have to refactor the whole thing and effectively rebuild it all from scratch. So which is more effort? Investing upfront in doing something that's more dynamic and flexible, or pushing it down the line and have to re-educate yourself about what you did and why you did it, and then rewrite the code anyways.
Awesome. If this were Twitch, I would say clip that and show your leadership team. But yes, let's all selfishly help the customer and our team achieve what they want to achieve easily. And with that, question and answers is over. Thank you very much, Ahmed. I'm going to hand this off now to Lucy to introduce our next speaker.
Awesome. So thank you again, Ahmed. So I'm really delighted to introduce our next speaker, who started talking about design systems ops back in 2016, when design systems were starting to gain momentum. He's worked on the Lightning design system at Salesforce, as well as various news media companies like The Guardian, BBC, Financial Times. He's currently a staff UX developer on the Polaris design system at Shopify, and also a founder of Design Tokens W3C community group, a huge advocate for design systems and accessibility. So today we have Kaelig, who will be sharing how Shopify uses design tokens with accessible theming as the technical foundation to our color system at Shopify. So I'm super lucky to have the chance to work with him. And on a side note, Kaelig recently welcomed a newborn to the world, so congrats. I think he's going on 4 hours of sleep today, so let's bear with him. And we're extremely thankful that you were able to take the time out to join us today. So without further ado, let's welcome Kaelig.
Hey, thank you so much for the introduction. As mentioned, I had 4.5 hours of sleep last night. So thank you so much for bearing with me. And if I don't finish some of my sentences, you'll know why. There's a very cute little thing that's been keeping me up at night. Okay, so today let's talk about the evolution of Shopify's color system. What I want you to take out of this talk is how Shopify's color system evolved to support new user and business needs, and how Polaris uses design tokens. And I'm going to go through a little bit what design tokens are about later in the talk, but this is the way we propagate our design decisions across products and platforms. What this talk does not cover, though, is I'm not going to cover everything design tokens have to offer. It's more of a case study of how we do things. In fact, some of the things I'm going to talk about probably won't work for your own use case. And then we won't go too deep into tooling, automation, the code that powers everything, but I'll touch on that a little bit. So let's go back to 2017. In 2017, Shopify announces a completely new design to unify its product offering across platforms and products. So on the left, you can see what we call the Shopify admin, which is where merchants are managing their stores online. Then in the middle, you can see the Shopify app. And then if you go to the right, this is our point of sales app. Before 2017, these experiences were slightly disjointed, and it didn't feel as fluid to go between devices and between products. And what we wanted to bring is not only that for our product, but this is also for apps. So this unified look and feel was, again, across product, platforms, and apps. Shopify is a platform for commerce, and the way we enable merchants to fulfill all of their dreams is that we allow them to extend the capabilities of our platform, and that's by installing apps. This is why we released Polaris, our open source design system and component library. Polaris is CSS and React based. This is what app developers on our platform can use, just like some folks are going to be using Swift UI or Material Design when they build for Apple and Google platforms. On the Shopify platform, you would want to use Polaris. Polaris introduced a new color palette at the time, and I don't have screenshots of the old admin, but it looked pretty dated and it looked pretty greenish. And our new color palette was more based on purples, indigos, and I'm going to go through a little bit more detail what that looked like. But what we ended up with is a series of swatches such as sky, ink, purple, indigo, green, red, etc. And then each swatch would have various shades. So in the case of the indigo swatch, you would have the lighter, light, default, dark, darker, and so those would be the kind of background surface shades. And then to overlay any text on top of those kind of lighter tones, we provide a text shade, which is going to provide accessibility for typically the lighter and the light shade, and also just making sure that the text blends well. And it's got this little tinting going on so that, the text blends again correctly with. I'm sorry, I'm rambling at this point, but let's go through the next slide. Okay, so how do you use this color system? Well, we have usage guidelines provided on the Polaris website. And again, Polaris is open source, so you can visit polaris.shopify.com, head to the design section of the site, and then you'll land on the color system. And this is what you will see. So in order, for example, to understand how to use the blue color, we would provide a series of do's and don'ts. In that example, the blue color should be used for information pips and text links, but don't use blue for buttons. And so this is how you would ramp up to understand, as a designer and as a developer, understand what the overall system looks like. And then from an implementation perspective, we would use something called SAS. SAS is a CSS preprocessor. And there's a typo in there, but that's fine. Okay, so the implementation looks like this. As a developer, all you have to care about is that, as you can tell on the right-hand side of the screen, to invoke the lighter shade of indigo, you would write color indigo lighter. What this brings to the table is great collaboration between designers and developers, where they speak exactly the same language between Sketch, which is the design tool we were using at the time, as well as the code. Sadly, this was not centralized at the time, and all of our platforms and our project had their own copy-pasted version of that palette. So we had iOS, Android, a Rails implementation of Polaris, a React implementation of Polaris, the documentation, and the sketch, all containing their own copy of that color system. And you can probably guess what happened. the issue here is that we couldn't track design decisions, the consistency across each project, the fact that they had copy-pasted that system, is that sometimes we would update a shade of blue somewhere and it wouldn't trickle down everywhere else. So kind of losing on that consistency front. From a maintainability perspective, again, when updating a color, so for example, at some point we wanted to improve the contrast level of links, and we ended up having to open something like 8 pull requests across various projects to just update a single shade of blue. And then because it was so Sass-centric, that code I showed earlier, JavaScript did not have access to the palette, but also to some other design decisions that we can tokenize, such as spacing, and which is also something that we introduced, a completely new spacing system, and typography, which we changed and modernized. So that's quite a few problems. So in around the end of 2017, early 2018, we introduced Polaris tokens, which is open source on GitHub at /Shopify/Polaris tokens. And the aim here was to keep things exactly the same for developers and designers. However, to fix that issue of not having a single source of truth. So how can we centralize all of these design decisions into a single place so that when we update it once and it trickles everywhere else? So I'm not going to go through too many details here, but what I want you to remember is that I wanted it to be super frictionless for developers and designers. So how do we store design tokens? Well, in our case, we store design tokens as platform agnostic, stack agnostic formats. So we use YAML to do that. You can use a variety of formats, but for us, it's YAML. And it's essentially a database of all of our colors. So key value pairs that, again, are platform specific. And then what we end up with is, let me go through this diagram. At the very top, we have our tokens, the platform agnostic version of our design decisions. Then we built a bunch of tooling that will take that input and output it, which is at the bottom of this diagram, output it to all of the platforms and all of the design tools that we needed to be available in. In that case, we needed to have those design decisions in an iOS-friendly format, in an Android-friendly format, in a Sketchpad format. We wanted it to be available to Framer for our prototypers, but also in Figma, which is the tool we've been using for about a year now at Shopify to design. And then we use TypeScript a lot, so we wanted our design tokens to be available in TypeScript with autocomplete for our developers, so they don't have to remember the syntax of absolutely every single color, and they can use that in JavaScript. And as if you can remember, in our previous approach, our design decisions were mostly available to SaaS developers. And thanks to this tooling, we have access to those design decisions also in our JavaScript stack, which is a big part of our product. And then again, for developers who were accustomed to using SaaS, we wanted that to be available with using the exact same helpers that they've been using for years. And then I introduced also for people who wanted to be experimenting with web components or didn't want to have a SaaS build step in their stack, I introduced CSS variables as well. So again, people still use the color function in SaaS if they need to. And then if they want to, they can use in the second snippet of code here, you can tell that they're using a CSS custom property, also known as CSS variable. In JavaScript, you would import those design tokens. And then if you wanted to use non-color values, but also benefit from having those design decisions available in JavaScript, and I'm talking about durations and spacing, which is super useful when you're building animations in JavaScript. Then what I wanted to give is access to these tokens as well. So at the very bottom, that snippet of code is somebody using tokens that are not colors. From an adoption perspective, it's been super good. Like I started it as a Hack Day project, kind of bringing my knowledge from Salesforce, which introduced design tokens to the world. And yeah, I just super happy with adoption. So it's now the Polaris tokens package is now a dependency across all of our main products. And so on NPM, it's being downloaded about 43,000 times a week by our various build systems and such, and continuous deployment environments, etc. And we also use those values to power the documentation on polaris.shopify.com. And prior to that, the documentation was always slightly out of sync with product, because again, we needed to create so many pull requests across the board to update a single shade that we always forgot about one or two. And then a little word on accessibility. Accessibility is a feature in this system, but it doesn't come for free. So you would have to understand the color system well enough and know your WCAG 2 AA kind of criteria to understand that you need to check for contrast whenever you're using various colors on like foreground, on background. So we do put a lot of trust in teams to do the right thing. I don't know why I wrote trust twice here. It's because we put a lot of it, I suppose, in people. But this means that sometimes when doing an accessibility review, we see some things that shouldn't have happened, and that's on the color system. I don't think it's on people here. And the funny note, this section contains my favorite don't of all the do's and don'ts of the website, which is don't fail. Good advice. Now, 2019 comes around the corner and we're up for another rebrand, this time mostly from a marketing perspective at first, but then we wanted that rebrand to also trickle down into the product. And this is something we're still working on and we're going to roll out over the next few months. In the product, I mean. So I found a part of our website that's kind of still using the old style. So you can see that's a marketing-ish website here. And you can tell there's a lot of purple going on there. The new design language is way more bold and represents way closer. So essentially, Shopify evolved doubled, tripled in size in the past few years. And we wanted to represent that. Even the number of our merchants and the variety of merchants that we service now is huge, and compared to a few years back. And we wanted to feel a bit more solid and trusted as a brand, and a little bit less playful than before. And so this new brand, and I'm not a great person to talk about it in length, but this new brand, if you look at it, it was purple. I mean, from a purely aesthetic perspective, it's more green. Let's put it that way. The marketing folks who are on this call must be like, what? Anyway, so like I said, we grew a lot. We introduced quite a few more products. We had products that were definitely not the admin, but it still had some sort of lived a bit in the admin, but also were outside, like their own apps, such as Kit, Ping, the new point of sales, Shopify Chat, warehouse robots. Now we acquired a company called 6 River System that builds those dank robots that are hopefully not going to take over the world. And we also did a complete rewrite of Shopify Checkout. There's a lot going on. I'm passing on so many other things. We even have products inside products. So now we support local delivery. We have something called Shopify Capital to lend money to merchants. Shopify Balance. We introduced digital gift cards at the very beginning of COVID. Shopify Fulfillment Network is something that's in the works. Way more marketing channels. We have Shopify Email, for example, that is helping people manage their email newsletters and campaigns. And a lot of advanced media management. So, for example, 3D models of products are coming to the admin. And yeah, it's just, there's a lot going on in the admin that we definitely didn't have 3 years ago. And what about dark mode? What about theming with some of our offerings, such as our enterprise offering, has a very different way of addressing merchants. Like we're talking to some Fortune 500s and some like really big companies, and they don't necessarily identify with the crafter type thing that a lot of Shopify merchants are going to be identifying with. And so we needed a separate visual identity for those for this product called Shopify Plus. But we don't support theming in the old system. And then what about nested theming? What if a part of the product needs to embed into the normal product, but look different and express a slightly different brand? So we have an example, which is the media manager. It always looks dark. It's like a kind of this dark room kind of metaphor of editing media and editing photo in the browser. And we want it to be super dark, but at the same time, we don't want the whole admin to be dark when we invoke that. So what if we had components that were reusable across all of our brands, but also can override that theming in a nested way? So there's a lot going on there. And we can't do that unless we manually overwrite CSS or rewrite entire components at the moment. So what should we do? So the solution here is to create a new color system, of course, because why not? And so the admin has evolved from this to something. So again, like if you take it from a purely aesthetic perspective, it's purple. It's more greenish. There's not a lot of green actually going on in that screen, but it's streamlined. It's a lot less cluttered, and the actions, instead of being purple, are going to be going on the green. And again, I'm not doing justice to what this whole new design is bringing, because there's a lot more going on, but I just want to kind of sum it up in a way that if you looked at it back and forth, this is what you would probably think. So we wanted to switch from having one brand, which is kind of the purpler version of the admin, to something that's more expressive. Having a system that, instead of being static, where people say in the code, tell a button to be indigo or purple, they're gonna have something that's more dynamic and that runs also at runtime, to allow for dark mode to be switched on and off, or to allow theme switching and nested theming to happen. This needs to be dynamic and happen on I'm losing the plot right now. Bear with me. 4 hours of sleep, boys and girls. Okay. So let me backtrack, and then the team can edit the YouTube video later on. Okay, we wanted to go from one brand to something that's more expressive and allows various brands, such as our Shopify Plus enterprise offering, to come in and use the exact same components as Polaris React components without having to rewrite them from scratch every time they want to reskin them. The static to dynamic switch needed to happen so that we could, at runtime, have components nested inside of other components and use different themes across the admin. Now, we wanted also to have something that's going from imperative. So imperative programming is going to be something like telling the system the component skin to be exactly a certain color, whereas declarative is expressing a concept of that color. And I'm going to go through a little bit more what that means, but that allows us for stuff like theming and dark mode. So how did we achieve this? We broke the system down in various categories, or in that case, roles, categories, and variants. And let's start with roles. The color roles are the variables that apply a theme to multiple areas at once in a purposeful way. And I'm kind of reciting the documentation here. And they're going to be the source of any theme, and I'll come back to that. We don't use the color roles directly in the UI, but there's a source of everything that will then trickle down. And you'll understand as I go through categories and roles later, and variants later. So for the base theme, we have 10 color roles, and they look like this. So we have a surface role, an on-surface role, interactive role, secondary, primary, critical, warning, success, and highlight. And then we have a decorative role that is missing from this outdated diagram that I'm going to update later today in our official documentation. So you may recognize some similarities with the material design color system here. We found that it was appropriate to think of things in terms of surfaces and on surfaces, and you'll see some examples later. Now, categories. Each part of the color variant name, which we're going to cover a little bit later, refers to a category. So once we're going to put together categories and end up with a color variant name. And let me go through what that means. So the categories are broken down into multiple columns here, from the most constant to the most variable categories. So elements, status, emphasis, states, and layered state. I'm not going to go through exactly what those mean, but what I can tell you is the way you would compose those categories to end up with a variant is that, for example, for a button, you would think of the button as an action. And then there's going to be a primary type of action. So the emphasis here is primary. And the state might be default, hovered, disabled, error, or pressed. And in that case, let's say I want to invoke the color as a concept, the color that should be applied to a button when it's hovered. I'm going to think of it as that's the action primary hovered variant. So the variant, which is in that case, for example, the action primary hovered variant, is what we actually use to style the UI. In Figma and in our CSS, this is what we would actually write. And we are documenting this for our designers to understand, and developers, of course, so that they can refer to variants in a way that makes sense, because it's a totally different mental model. It's a huge shift from before, where you would tell a background, hey, your color gray, whereas now it's more of a symbolic way of referring to colors. So in that case, that diagram shows the surface, and I'm not going to go through every single example, but I can show you interactive, because that's a great way to go back to the example I had, where it was some sort of action variant. And so yeah, so those checkboxes at the on the left here are referring to the interactive kind of symbolic way of thinking about the color. And then the selected surface for a checked item in this list would be again referring to the surface selected variant. And then if you have a focus ring around any of those items in the list, it would be the focused interactive variant. And then we have secondary variants, and I'm not going to go through everything, but this gives you an idea. We're finding this action primary and action primary selected, and we could have this action primary hover version of the variant that I talked about earlier. We have the same for critical, warning, highlight, success. And success and warning are really interesting because before we would just refer to them as red or green. And as you can tell, if you're trying to do theming, red or green is super descriptive. It's imperative programming, as in we're telling the background to be green or red, but there's no room for theming again. And then decorative, which is kind of something to put accent colors in the admin, which can be useful to integrate some level of expressiveness in the in some areas. For example, in homepage, there could be a card that's a bit more playful and it's a bit more like marketing driven. We also use that for our avatars. And so all of these variants are leading to about 150 colors total. And the way we generate them is that we use our roles and we treat them as an API. That's going to be our theming API. So you wouldn't, as a designer, if you created a new theme, you wouldn't have to create 150 colors yourself. What you would do is that you would define some main roles, and those are surface, on surface, interactive, etc. And then we have tooling that will generate all of these the variants for you. We generate those as JSON and CSS and TypeScript as well, so that if you're switching between light and dark mode, for example, this will be generated for you. The way we generate all the tokens, and it's okay if like I'm going super fast through this, but it's okay if you don't understand right now. I'm just going to give a demo later on, and you'll see the power of this system. So we take that theme, those 10 colors that we provided ourselves, we pass it through our HSLove, and I'm going to talk quickly about it, HSLove based config, and then we obtain tokens. In that case, we have the config looks like this. Each variant is going to have a name and a transform. So in the case of border critical, we decide that we're going to transform the one of the categories into a certain lightness. And then text critical will also get a lightness transform. And then we have some other transformations such as the hue, the saturation, the lightness. And so it's a lot of mathematical functions that we can apply to the theme and then generate all the tokens for you, again, in light and dark mode. I said I would talk a little bit about HSLove. It's a uniform color space based on CIE LUV, LUV? I don't know. SILUV, transposed to be used the exact same way we use HSL. And the reason why we're happy that this is using the same API as HSL is because people are super familiar with the way hue, saturation, and lightness can be varied upon. However, HSL itself suffers from a few issues. And so here's the color space. I don't know how that renders on your screen right now on YouTube and on the stream, but the reason why we think HSLove is more appropriate than HSL is that when you vary the lightness of HSL, the contrast is not super consistent, whereas with HSLove, the contrast is super consistent. If you want to know more about getting a fair comparison between HSLove, HSL, and a few other color spaces, you can look at hslove.org, and it goes through the theory, the maths that goes behind it, and it's pretty niche, but we find it super human friendly and especially useful for, again, that predictability of when we vary the lightness, apply mathematical functions to it, it's going to keep it accessible. So all of this gives us, as a recap, is we're getting easy theming with 10 values that we pass as a theme, and then all of these other variants that are symbolic ways of referring to color. That enables richer brand expression in our products. So far, we're only using it for the redesign, like the greenish looking redesign. But eventually, we'd like our third-party apps, and I may be getting ahead of myself here, but essentially, we have some B2B offerings as well, and they would like to have some sort of theming. And sadly, they can't always use Polaris itself because it looks so much like the admin. Dark mode is possibly coming in the future. We're not sure we're going to roll it out, but it comes for free with this system. Accessibility is baked in again. And future friendliness is what we're looking at here, because again, the fact that we have symbolic ways of referring to colors enable us to change them and improve the whole way the system works across our product, without having to go change our entire code base, where there's something like 5,000 occurrences of imperative color values from the old system. So I don't know if that video is going to play correctly. I'm hoping so. Let's give it a try. This is a demo of me going. Let me head back to it because that went super quick. Okay, so this is what the new admin looks like. I'm switching to our dark mode, switching back to our light mode. And then on the right-hand side, I'm going to look at switching some theme values. So these are the roles. And all I'm doing here is playing around with the role colors. And then on the fly, a new theme a whole new palette is being generated and applied to the left-hand side. And all of that in an accessible way. I haven't checked the color contrast everywhere, but I'm pretty sure that that we're good to go. This is ugly, but it just shows how powerful this is. And then we're going to look at some hover states. Modals are also getting styled. And then we're going to go to dark mode. And the dark mode is also inheriting from this theme that we've seen earlier. Okay, so that's it for now. I've seen possible cons for this approach. One is the learning curve. This is a totally new mental model, and operating the shift at our scale with hundreds of developers and hundreds of UXers might be a bit of a challenge. So we have some education initiatives going on, and we're super stoked about people going in there and updating their components and making sure this new color system is going to get rolled out. We're supporting at the same time in our code base right now the new design language and the old design language, which is a super interesting engineering challenge. And there's a possible performance hit with nested themes, but it's too early to tell. It's just because of the sheer amount of generated CSS variables in the DOM. It's too early to tell so far, but we want to keep a look at it. Yeah, and so my fear by the fact that maybe it's hard, if it's hard to learn, people might misuse it, and then we end up not being that future friendly. But hopefully our education initiatives will be doing great. Yeah, this is it. I've glanced over quite a few things in this talk. It goes way deeper. I could go deeper into the maths. I could go deeper into the tooling. I could go deeper into the one thing you could tell I could not go deeper into is the kind of marketing thinking around how this relates to our brand. This is not my area of expertise, but I also want to give a shout out to all the people who have worked on this, and I'm probably going to forget a few, but Jesse BC, Alex Page, Sarah Hill, and we've got a few awesome developers who also worked on that, on the whole HS Love transformation system. So we've got Tim Layton and Dan Rosenthal. And yeah, just wanted to give him a shout out, and all the folks in the creative directions team at Shopify, who some of them, and Martin, for example, who created this awesome Figma plugin that can import our tokens and put them into our or Figma styles. I just love that kind of cross-team collaboration. So this is not all me. Like this is a huge team effort. And right now we've got a ton of engineers and designers updating their patterns to match the new design language. And hopefully this will be rolled out in the next few months. Thank you so much for listening to me rambling with my 4 hours of sleep. And hopefully that made some sense. And yeah, I'd love to get your questions. And you can hit me up on at Kaelig on Twitter. My DMs are open. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Kaelig, for giving our members a deep look into the use of tokens for Polaris. I haven't personally seen like the demo, the theming demo in action, so that was so cool to see. And I remember thinking, like, as your team was developing the color roles and the specifics of like, I don't know, just the thoughtfulness of each color and how it plays a role in the functional system. I thought it was really cool, just in contrast with our marketing palette. So where it's like, you guys were more functional and we were more expressive, but definitely super, super cool. I think we have a bunch of questions. So yeah, let's get to it. Varun, do you want to start off?
Sure, I'll kick it off. We're at 1:25, so we'll give this about 10 more minutes and go a bit overtime. So feel free to leave, but don't miss out on this Q&A. Let's kick it off. The first question, Kaelig, is what does the designer, developer, and content collaboration look like when using design tokens?
Oh, when using design tokens? Oh, that's a good question. Well, for content, I'm not sure they're that involved in using the design tokens themselves. However, to define design tokens, the content strategists, and that we now call, since as of today, content designers, they were involved deeply into making sure the names made sense, they were learnable, and culturally they made sense to the whole company. Since now Shopify is becoming more global, we wanted to make sure it was approachable. And then when using design tokens, we want to make sure that designers and developers have the same frame of reference and they call things the exact same way. And ideally, there's also parity in the values across platforms. Not always, because some platforms might need slightly different shades, which is fine. This is why we have this symbolic way of thinking about tokens and colors. But essentially, when the designer tells the developer, oh, by the way, I want this to be a action, critical, primary, whatever, like one of those variants, the developer should know exactly what to type. And there's no back and forth going on, like asking, oh, what's the hex value, by the way? And thanks to the way design tools work today is that by bringing the code tab, or the inspect tab, as it's called in some design tools, you can see what the designer meant as a developer, and just literally copy and paste that into your code and just change the syntax so it looks like either Sass or a CSS variable or JavaScript or XML, whatever you're using. But yeah, does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna go back and tell my team to start using them.
Nice.
Lucy, to you.
Yep. So the next question is, would you say that concepts such as design tokens are something that you can recommend to teams of any size? And if so, when is an ideal time to adopt?
Yeah, I think it's never too early to start speaking the same language in a team. It's going to streamline your collaboration and your handoff process. I don't like this word, but it might even kill the whole handoff process if you have a good shared layer of language across code and design. And what you end up shipping is going to be something that's imperfect at some point, and you want to have a way to iterate really quickly. And typically that's the issue that small teams are facing, is how can we iterate quickly and go super fast to get product validation, and then iterate on that super, super fast. Well, I think design tokens are a great way to do that. However, I would say the tooling cost of setting up a code base or repository, etc., is not accessible to everyone yet. And that's why we created the design token Stebber 3C community group, is to start thinking about a specification that will allow the design tools to all be able to import, export tokens, and hopefully the tooling around it to be more accessible to teams of any size and any disciplines, because not every design team has developers on it. And like on the Polaris team, we're super lucky to have many developers and many designers, content strategists. Until recently, we had a researcher. And so having this dedicated resources is not the day-to-day, unfortunately, of every team. So I'm hoping that in the future, this will be just a few clicks and you'll get design tokens. I know that if you're using the InVision suite of tools, DSM is a good way to get started with that without knowing much code and telling your developers, hey, here's an API endpoint, you can use that, and this is all the tokens, all the design decisions we've made are documented there. But aside from that, the way we do it is it's not complicated. It's just you need a dev or a designer who codes to get it done. So, but from an approach perspective, totally on board with any size should be looking into it.
Cool. Yeah, I think one thing that, I don't know, sometimes teams forget is that it's not a design system is not something that you just ship it and launch it and forget it. It's something like you build upon and you treat it like a product, and you're constantly working at it and iterating. And so, yeah, design tokens really help with that.
All right, on to the next one. And I'm going to pick the other one because I have a question on top of that. You mentioned tokens used for spacing earlier. Kaelig, you were talking about how tokens are used for colors in your presentation. What other things can you tokenize? And how do teams decide what they should tokenize?
I would start with colors for sure. Typography is also something you can tokenize. You can even tokenize it in a responsive way. So you don't have to have one set of tokens. You can have platform-specific or viewport-specific token families or sets. Spacing, definitely. You can tokenize breakpoints as well if you have various viewport sizes that you want to support. And you want to kind of standardize the way people think and name those. What else? You can tokenize animations. You can tokenize bits of an animation, so durations, easing curves, those kind of things. Yeah, so in typography, you can also break it down in line heights, font sizes, scales. You can tokenize your grid, any design decision really. And I've even seen people use tokens for logos, icons, those kind of things. You can go pretty deep.
How much is too much to tokenize, and like how do you determine what to tokenize?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think it depends.
Yeah.
Because I've seen, for example, I've seen like Salesforce, it's baked into that platform, and they have hundreds of tokens, but at the same time, it is enabling people to actually skin the product in a way that makes sense for them. But maybe your design system that just started doesn't need that level of tokenization. And in fact, if you don't have solid documentation and rationale tracking behind every single token, you might end up creating debt and problems for later. Because once it's out, the token is out, it's out. So people might be using it. And if people use it, then you have to maintain it. So think about the long-term maintenance cost of introducing such complexity. But yeah, what I was talking about, like the basics, colors, grids, the super low-level basics of a design system. I think that
Right.
That's like, you should start with that.
The foundational pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Our next question is, how do your designers interact with design tokens? Do they get a chance to make it or customize it?
They use them through Figma right now. So in the styles panel of Figma, that's where they would get them. Do they make them? I don't think so. I mean, we have some designers dedicated to thinking about the color palette and the mathematical model behind that palette. So thinking about the contrast levels between surfaces and the foregrounds. No, yeah, it's not like you can have a democratic kind of thinking around branding, I think. So I would say, no, they don't. As far as I know, I don't think they are willy-nilly just coming into the file and changing tokens there.
All right, we'll do one last one, Kaelig, and I'm going to pick the one which has a name on it. So Donnie Tomato asked, I'm familiar with the approach of presenting. Interested to know if you found places where it's difficult to apply design tokens. For example, an input placeholder text color.
I'm not sure. I mean, I need to understand why this is complex to apply to a placeholder. I've seen that composed tokens sometimes are a bit tricky. Like in animations is really, for me, the hardest part, because it's so much of it is feel. And sometimes you have values that are super strict, like 0.3 seconds is the timing we use for all of our transitions. And sometimes you want to have some sort of choreography around your UI that is really hard to tokenize. And sometimes you have to remove 50 milliseconds from one bit so that the other bit looks awesome. And so for me, animations is the hardest part to systemize and to tokenize. And so what I would say is, if a system is over tokenizing and it becomes a constraint, it could be an issue. Sometimes you want to escape hatch. And so I would say, yeah, animations for me is the hardest part.
Cool.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Go ahead, Lucy.
Sorry, I was just gonna wrap up because yeah, but if you wanted to make a comment on that, yeah, feel free.
No, I'm good. Loved all the answers, Kaelig. Learned a lot.
Nice. Yeah, we have a bunch of other questions, but we won't take up any more of your time. I hope that you get some sleep. I would encourage people to just reach out to Kaelig on Twitter if you have further questions that you want to ask him about tokens and Polaris and all the things. So yeah, thank you, Kaelig. Awesome
Thanks so much.
talk. So I think that's a wrap. Thank you everyone for attending our second remote meetup. Stay tuned for upcoming events and other design system chapter meetups. And follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn for those updates. And last but not least, to help us improve on our meetups, we would love if you guys could provide us some feedback, either with the QR code that you see on screen. Just use your camera and your phone to go to the feedback form, or just the bit.ly link below. I think that's it.
Thanks.
That's a wrap.
Indeed, there is a link to the questionnaire in the YouTube description below. That's convenient. Thank you so much for sticking with us and learning about laying foundations for quality. We learned a lot from Ahmad's talk and from Kaelig's talk. Starting things early, building for quality means the investment you make pays off in many, many ways. And with that, take care, and please visit our website, designsystems.community. We also have a new resources center, so check that out. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.